In this discussion, we shall actually continue the threads of the earlier discussion on the emergence of a left factor in Indian politics during the 1930s. It had made its impact on the Congress as well. Under the impact of the socialist vision, impact of Marxism, the emergence of Soviet Union, the Congress itself was called upon by these changes to engage with this new vision about society and politics. Now, this left-right divide also had something to do with competing visions about liberal social order as well. The focus of this left alternative in the Congress, of course, were personalities like Jawaharlal Nehru or Subhash Chandra Bose, to name a few top-grade leaders, but at the same time you have an intermediary leadership structure emerging from within the Congress ranks who were very anxious to reorient the Congress towards a new political line, largely because of the kind of influence that Marxism or socialism made on their mind. Within what we may call the liberal vision of the Congress, the difference became manifest in 1938 when Subhash Chandra Bose, as Congress President, set up the National Planning Committee. The manner in which the National Planning Committee tried to set out the agenda for the future, emphasizing on the importance of a planned economy, actually shows how deeply the Soviet planning had influenced these generations. On the other hand, a new liberal vision was also emerging with the intervention of John Maynard Keynes. The Keynesian liberalism, as it is described, visualized the possibility of an active state intervention in the economy for the betterment of the conditions of the poor and the underprivileged people. Tax the rich and give some resources to the poor was ultimately the foundation of what we know as welfare economics. So in liberalism also there was an important change taking place at that time, when liberalism was moving away from their position on how the state should not intervene in society and economics towards the more interventionist stance, where the liberals had to recognize the necessity of government intervention in social life, in economic life, in order to redress the grievances of the underprivileged people. I would imagine that apart from the socialist vision, which was to a large extent influenced by the successful planned economy experiment in Soviet Union, the increasing accent on welfare in liberalism also was a very important factor in reorienting people like Nehru and Bose towards a completely different vision about how the nation state in future would actually put great stress on the planned economy. The left-wing movement in the Congress, therefore, was an ideological challenge in the first place. But then, this ideological challenge increasingly was acquiring a concrete shape with the formation of the Congress Socialist Party.
Excuse me, sir, what was exactly the agenda of the Congress Socialist Party?
Congress Socialist Party was formed in 1934. Sometime before the National Planning Committee began to deliberate on the future of Indian economy or Indian society. It represented the left in the Congress, a ginger group which included men like Jayaprakash Narayan, Ashok Mehta, Achyut Patwardhan, Narendra Deb. These were not necessarily Marxists, but they were socialists, because as you know, among socialists there were different strands of socialism. Some felt that the state must be more active in promoting welfare. Some felt that workers' cooperatives needed to be set up to allow the workers escape from the oppression of capitalism. Some felt that the workers must participate in a revolution in order to create a new society. Socialism had different strands. So some of these men were not necessarily Marxists, but a few of them actually were oscillating between the old kind of socialist vision, the Marxist vision, and incorporated words like scientific socialism in their agenda. So CSP can be counted as the more organized expression of this left-wing vision or socialist vision in Indian politics. Despite their socialist leanings, they decided to work within the Congress on the calculation that it would be possible for them to reorient the Congress towards a new direction. Socialism for some of them was a rhetoric. In the future, some of these Congress socialists moved away from the position that they had taken in the 1930s. But if you look at the Congress socialist leadership structure, you see a measure of deep commitment to an entirely new vision. And they naturally looked upon men like Jawaharlal Nehru or Subhash Chandra Bose as their leaders. But Nehru and Bose, none of them joined the Congress Socialist Party. They didn't. They also, we find in them a lot of ambivalence and ambiguities. They were willing to sail with the socialists. They were willing to accept the socialist rhetoric, but they were not always ready to break with the mainstream leadership, with the dominant leadership of the Congress or with Gandhi. When we actually look at this agenda, we see the very important difference between the Congress Socialist vision and the mainstream Congress vision. The Congress Socialists were very keen to adopt a radical agrarian program. They were willing to go to the extent of suggesting complete abolition of zamindari, a position that many of the mainstream Congress leaders were not willing to take. They were connected with the Kisan Sabhas. They derived much support from the Kisan Sabhas. They were espousing the cause of the state people. So they were suggesting that the Congress must adopt a more positive attitude towards the movements that had already started happening in these princely states by bringing them within the Congress fold. In other words, extending nationalism into the princely states which had remained for many years insulated from these movements. They were in favor of protective legislations for labor. They wanted to reduce working hours. They wanted to extend health insurance facilities. They wanted to improve on the living conditions of the working hours, giving them better housing, improving on wages. They were in favor of more radical mass mobilization at a time when the congressmen were not ready for embarking on another round of mass mobilization and mass movement. Congress Socialists were very emphasizing the need for the Congress to undertake immediately mass movements. They were willing even to cross the Gandhian limits in order to achieve the success. And finally, you have this notion of the planned economy.
Sir, what was the strength of the Congress Socialist Party, or rather, from which section of the Indian society did they derive support?
In other words, what sort of people were there? I mean, who were the people who actually rallied behind the Congress Socialist Party? Now, the answer to this question has to come to terms with the complexities within Congress politics. There should always be men who are not so committed to this Congress Socialist vision ideologically, but they would still pay lip service to this socialist or radical rhetoric in order to settle their scores within the organization. People not committed so wholeheartedly to the socialist vision would still be aligned with the Congress Socialists in order to achieve a kind of prominence or dominance within the organization. But others, like Narendra Dev or Jayaprakash Narayan, were ideologically motivated people, and one of the major sources of support for them, of course, was the connection with the Kisan movement. They were closely allied with the Kisan Sabhas. Many of their supporters came from the Kisan Sabhas. And around 1936, when the All India Kisan Sabha was formed, it was formed on the basis of the emergence of several such Kisan Sabha outfits all over the country. N.G. Ranga, for example, a leader from Andhra, had established a very powerful Kisan movement in Andhra. So N.G. Ranga was a leading Congress socialist. In Bihar, Swami Sahajanand. Sahajanand had already started mobilizing the peasants. After the Kisan mobilization had come to a halt for some time during the early 1930s, there was a revival, there was a renewed initiative towards peasant mobilization. But because of the Congress Socialist intervention, because of the kind of persuasion that the Congress Socialists were able to make, Sahajananda was also increasingly becoming attracted to the socialist rhetoric, which he didn't uphold earlier. He was not in favor of complete abolition of zamindari, but increasingly, because of the connection that the Congress Socialists actually maintained with people like Sahajanand, with Kisan Sabha activists, the Sahajanand also began to shrug off his initial hesitation about the radical program and adopted it as a part of the Kisan Sabha agenda. In the labor movement, the communists had already become very active. We have seen already how communists were becoming involved in mobilization and labor, along with others, of course, but increasingly in certain parts of in Bombay or in Bengal, the communists were becoming a very powerful factor in the labor movement. And with these communists, the Congress Socialists had their connections. In fact, the communists were now very anxious to function within the Congress. For the communists, the Congress Socialist Party was the natural outfit within which they worked. The communists felt the need for working in the Congress for a number of reasons. In the first place, as you know, between 1934 and 1942, the Communist Party was outlawed. So it was natural for the communists to use the Congress as their cover. They wished to advance the interest of their party or the kind of ideology that they were espousing. But at the same time, in order to survive, they needed a cover, and they decided to function within the Congress Socialist Party, of course, was their choice. Some of the Congress Socialists, however, through a process of disillusionment with the Congress, moved away from Congress Socialism later to form the Communist Party in certain regions. Take, for example, the cases of A.K. Gopalan or A.M.S. Namboodiripad in Kerala. They started as radical congressmen. They were involved in the Congress Socialist Party in the region. They were involved in Kisan Sabha activities. Namboodiripad, for that matter, was a close collaborator of N.G. Ranga. But gradually, these two leaders became the main foundation of the Communist Party in Kerala. Sundaraya in Andhra Pradesh, for example, was a Congress socialist. One of the reasons was for the communists to function within the Congress Socialist outfit was, of course, the outlawing of the party for 8 years. The other reason was the United Front idea. Dimitrov from 1935 had directed many of the communists to function within mainstream nationalism. So under the impact of these factors, the communists also started functioning within the Congress Socialist Party. Others were disillusioned congressmen, people who had become disillusioned with the Congress policies, the Congress's increasing connection with the propertied classes. They found CSP as an alternative to the organization dominated by what came to be known as the Congress right. In the context of the gradual petering out of the civil disobedience initiative, and after 1937, when the Congress accepted office and the Congress right increasingly displayed extremely conservative tendencies. So the right was becoming defined within the Congress as against whom the left was pitted in the 1930s, when some future communists were using CSP program as a part of their apprenticeship with radical politics. In this context, the divide between the right and left that we have been talking about became very clearly defined. There was a defined left-wing group in the Congress. There was a right-wing group in the Congress. So this right-left divide made CSP activity more meaningful than usual.
Sir, what was the nature of this right-left divide in the Congress?
In the first place, it's an ideological challenge. It's an ideological level, one may say. But the meaning of such levels change over time. Somebody who is a right today may be a left tomorrow. Somebody who is a left today may be a right tomorrow. The left challenged or the right-wing divide that we are talking about certainly had very tangible ideological dimension. We have already stated a few points about it. In the context of the 1930s, however, there were certain issues which made this division more meaningful. Take, for example, the usual emphasis of Gandhi and his immediate followers on what is known as the controlled agitation. Instead of a controlled agitation, many of the Congress Socialists like Jayaprakash Narayan, for example, favored a massive mobilization, a kind of spontaneous upsurge of the laboring men, of the peasants. The Gandhians would put great emphasis on reconstruction program, avoiding social radicalism. On the other side, you have the protagonists of the left ideology who would come up with more radical ideas. And these radical ideas were expected to be translated not merely into a political program adopted by the Congress, but also as the foundation of the future state policy. Take, for example, Nehru's espousing some of these radical visions, Nehru stating some of these radical visions between April and December 1936 in the Congress sessions at Lucknow and Faizpur. Nehru, as usual, was not willing to force it upon the Congress, but it is also unmistakable that he was willing to adopt the socialist program. He was willing to at least put the socialist program on the agenda. Office acceptance emerged as a very important issue. Nehru and many of these Congress socialists felt that the Congress, in the context of the limitations of the reforms of 1935, should not enter office. They participate in the elections, win seats, but they shouldn't become ministers. In a constitution which the Congress itself had decried for the enormous power that the constitution still retained with the governor. In fact, this was one of the issues regarding the 1935 Act. The Congress had reservations about the way the governor was retained with enough reserved powers despite the creation of responsible government in the provinces. So, refusal to take office was an important political issue that was emerging. A man like Jayaprakash Narayan, for example, would recommend complete rejection of office, but the Congress right wouldn't actually agree with this position. Like, for example, the idea of corporate membership of the Kisan Sabhas and the labor unions in the Congress. So, Nehru in one of these sessions actually had called for corporate membership of all the Kisan Sabhas and the labor unions within the Congress. It's a very different kind of idea. All these Kisan Sabhas and the labor unions would be entitled to send delegates to the Congress. The Congress right was not willing to accept this. So, they diluted this program by calling upon congressmen to go into a mass contact program. The Congress Socialists wanted to expand the organization by including the people in large number. The right-wing congressmen would not actually approve of this. They limit the number of delegates. Nehru was actually willing to sail with these new ideas, which was the reason why in 1936 he included people like Jayaprakash Narayan, Patwardhan and Narendra Dev in his working committee. So you can see how in the context of the 1930s, the division was appearing. Some congressmen resisting these kinds of changes that some of the left-wing congressmen were recommending in expanding the party, in starting another round of movements, in taking a position against office acceptance. So, pitted against this left were the right. The right would insist on office acceptance, would not allow this very huge expansion of the organization, would not allow the affiliation of all these trade unions and the Kisan Sabhas. Moreover, the right also came to be defined in terms of the links that they maintained with business interests. So, on one hand, They were advocating office acceptance under the rubric of the new constitution that was adopted by the government in 1935, despite the many limitations against which the Congress had reservations. On the other hand, the right in the Congress who maintained a very close relations with business lobbies. And it was largely because of the kind of pressure that the business interest actually exerted on these congressmen that the Congress ultimately became willing to accept office. The businessmen had their own interest to look after, but if they could have their friends in government, they were likely to do better. Now, some of these men, whom historians eventually would come to describe as the Congress right, were also people who had resisted the idea of council entry in the 1920s, when, as you know, this issue of council entry had led Swaraj leaders like Chittaranjan Das and Motilal Nehru to form the Swarajya Party. On that occasion, the devout Gandhians were against council entry. But now, with age, their attitudes had undergone very significant changes, as a result of which this very powerful section of the Congress leadership, including men like Vallabhbhai Patel, Rajagopalachari or Rajendra Prasad, they were willing to go into ministry making. And ultimately, the outcome of Congress Socialist demand for an extensive mobilization was a kind of mass contact committee. That committee was a non-starter fund basically, partly because of the reason that at that time the Congress became very preoccupied with assembly politics, with elections, so much to the annoyance of those leaders like Jayaprakash Narayan, who had suggested complete rejection of office acceptance. These leaders insisted on the principle of conditional acceptance. Now, this would create complications in the future. But the point is that they decided to enter office. They decided to enter government. And after their impressive electoral victories in some of the states like United Provinces, Orissa, Bihar, Central Provinces, Bombay, Madras, Northwestern Frontier Provinces, and then also in Assam in 1938, Congress government was formed. Once the Congress was in power, there are clear indication of how the consolidation of the right around the government, with connections with the business interests and the property classes, it became a story of what the historian Vinita Damodaran describes in her study of Bihar, a story of broken promises.
Sir, why do historians argue that this was a story of broken promises?
Now, I have taken this word broken promises from Vinita Damodaran's work, which is basically a study of how the Bihar ministry went back on their emancipatory promises and began to adopt repressive measures against the peasant movement. But you can see similar sources of disillusionment among radical or left-wing congressmen because of the performance of the Congress ministers, not just in Bihar but elsewhere too. In the first place, once the Congress was in power, the Congress became a part of the establishment. So the kind of hostility that the Congress had shown towards the British bureaucracy was likely to be mollified considerably because of their closeness to power. The moment some congressmen actually began to feel that they were the rulers, the kind of liberal socialist rhetoric that they were espousing was likely to be diluted. You can see the dilution in the soft pedaling of the agrarian program in Bihar. The whole question of abolition of zamindari was shelved for the time being. You have the case of the Bombay Trade Disputes Act adopted by a government under Vallabhbhai Patel, which actually provided for heavy penalty and jail term for participating in illegal strikes. So there are many instances of how Congress leaders now in government were actually going back on their emancipatory promises. They were now wholeheartedly on the side of order, stability, and property. They were willing to coerce the trade unions. They were against Kisan movements. So this is the evidence on which basis some historians would argue that once they were in power, they moved away from their earlier position. The consolidation of the right ultimately managed to create a complete stranglehold over the organization with the ouster of Subhash Chandra Bose from Congress presidency in Tripuri. You know that at Tripuri Congress, Subhash Bose banked on the left support within the Congress. Subhash Bose was a man of the left. The CSP had propped him up as the claimant for Congress presidency in Tripuri, but as you know, Gandhi stated that Subhash's victory over Sitaramaya was my defeat, and finally you have this very murky story of how Subhash Bose had to abdicate his presidency. And I think the Tripuri debacle drew the final curtain. So you are looking at this period when the Congress left and the Congress right were pitted against each other. There were deep reasons for them to feel estranged from one another. So this gives you a sense of how the left-right divide in the Congress had evolved in the course of the latter half of the 1930s.